Monsignor, I'm going to throw in a little story I told you. When we had the one time we were able to do Orientale Lumen in the UK, it was in near Birmingham. And the then Bishop of Birmingham, who is now the Archbishop of Westminster, Archbishop Vincent Nichols, said, "You really have to meet this young priest of ours." Or, that I know, he said. Paul McPartlan, you know. He didn't exactly say that he was the greatest thing since sliced bread, but he talked him up a great deal. So I was not surprised when the name started to show up as I understand it, the premier Catholic scholar of the theology of John Zizioulas, among other things. So, Metropolitan John of Pergamon. Monsignor Paul McPartlan is a priest of the Archdiocese of Westminster and the Carl J. Peter Professor of Systematic Theology and Ecumenism across the street at Catholic University of America. It's not pronounced Newcastle, is it? That's how
Yes,
it is. It is, okay. He was born in Newcastle upon Tyne and graduated from Cambridge in mathematics in 1978. Having studied philosophy and theology at the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome, he was ordained a priest by Cardinal Basil Hume in 1984. He gained his doctorate from Oxford and then served for 4 years in a London parish. After holding a postdoctoral research fellowship at St. Edmund's College, Cambridge, from 1993 to 1995, he was appointed to the faculty of Heathrow College in the University of London, where he taught systematic theology for 10 years before coming to CUA in 2005. Father Paul served for 2 terms on the International Theological Commission, 2004 to 2009, 2009 to 2014. He's been a member of the International Commission for Theological Dialogue between the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church since 2005, and he has also served as a member of the International Anglican Roman Catholic and Roman Catholic Methodist dialogues. He is also a member of our North American Orthodox Catholic Theological Consultation, and he was appointed as a papal chaplain by Pope Benedict XVI in 2008. Please welcome Monsignor Paul McPartlan, who will speak to us on the topic tonight, Catholic Orthodox Dialogue and the Chieti document. Monsignor.
Thank you very much indeed, Bishop John Michael. Your Eminence, Archbishop Job, and dear friends, it's a very great pleasure to be participating in this Orientale Lumen conference dedicated to the 2 major events of 2016 from our point of view. The Holy and Great Council that was held in Crete and the Chieti Agreed Statement. Now, we all have our different tasks and competencies here during these few days, and I thank Jack very much for inviting me to speak about Catholic Orthodox dialogue and about the Chieti document on synodality and primacy in the first millennium. It's a particular pleasure to be doing so in the company of some of my dear colleagues from the International Dialogue. I hope you have the handout that went round with significant dates, events, quotes relating to the ecumenical movement at large over the last 100 years or so. The story of Catholic Orthodox dialogue is, of course, woven into that bigger story. The handbook is just for reference, don't worry, we're not going to go through it line by line. And some of you who perhaps were here 2 years ago may remember that I gave an earlier version of this sheet on that occasion when I spoke at Orientale Lumen, when our topic was primacy and perspectives on primacy. But let me reassure you, it may be the same handout, it is not the same talk. Some years ago, an Orthodox student drew my attention to the apostolic letter Praeclara Gratulationis, written in 1894 by Pope Leo XIII on the reunion of Christendom. Pope Leo particularly desired reunion between the Eastern churches and the Catholic Church. And he spoke with great warmth of the Eastern churches. I quote, "The principal subject of contention," he said, "is the primacy of the Roman pontiff." And he urged the East, and I quote again, "to return to that one holy faith which has been handed down to both of us from time immemorial." Before the man-made division between us, he said, the East, like the West, agreed without hesitation in its obedience to the Pontiff of Rome as the legitimate successor of St. Peter and therefore the Vicar of Christ on earth. End of quote. Well, sorry, but that's not an accurate reading of history. More accurate is what the Chieti document says, namely, that in the first millennium, while the Bishop of Rome was certainly held in honor in the East did not see him, as the West did, as the successor of Peter. And he did not exercise canonical authority over the churches of the East. Moreover, the title Vicar of Christ for the Bishop of Rome was not even adopted in the West until around 1200 by Pope Innocent III. So, despite his best intentions, those statements by Pope Leo were actually very skewed historically. And it's not really surprising, therefore, that his call to the East bore little fruit. The Patriarch of Constantinople said in a letter of his own in 1895 that he hesitated to respond to Pope Leo's letter because, and I quote, "It is unprofitable to speak to the ears of those who do not hear." In recent years, the international dialogue has been making great efforts to listen very carefully to one another and to portray history accurately. That's one of the reasons why it's taken 9 years to achieve the Chieti Agreement after the groundbreaking Ravenna document of 2007. First of all, we painstakingly produced a historical document on the first millennium, but it was voted down by the Orthodox at Vienna in 2010. And then some thought we should simply abandon history altogether, since we will never agree on it. And so we tried a strongly theological document. But that too failed in Amman, Jordan, in 2014. And so then we sought a judicious combination of history and theology, and finally succeeded at Chieti. Third time lucky, you might well say. And the Chieti document very significantly said this: it is necessary to reflect upon history. God reveals himself in history. It's particularly important, it said, to undertake together a theological reading of the history of the Church's liturgy, spirituality, institutions, and canons, which always have a theological dimension. Now you may recall that Pope Leo urged the Eastern churches to return to that one holy faith which has been handed down to both of us. In other words, he took it that they had broken away from the Catholic Church. Now, it's only fair to acknowledge the mirror image of that view which is often found among Orthodox. We are all tainted by the same tendency to see history in a self-favoring way. 2 years ago, in an Orthodox church in Massachusetts, I picked up a leaflet, and here it is, with the title, "A Timeline of Church History, Tracing the Birth and Continuity of the Orthodox Church from Pentecost to the Present." As you may be expecting, the diagram inside showed a straight line of continuity from Pentecost to the Orthodox Church today. The Roman Catholic Church is shown branching off in 1054. At that point, it says, the Roman Patriarch pulled away from the other four, pursuing his long-developed claim of universal headship of the Church. End of quote. So you see, it was the Catholics that broke away. As an Englishman, I was particularly intrigued by its interpretation of what happened in 1066. As every English schoolboy knows, that was the date of the Norman Conquest, when the French invaded England. The monarchy, laws, language, and architecture of England were changed forever. According to the leaflet, however, there was another change, which I must say I'd never heard mentioned before. 1066, it said, Norman conquest of Britain. Orthodox hierarchs replaced by those loyal to Rome. Well, I thought, there's a novel perspective. What about St. Augustine of Canterbury, sent from Rome to England by Pope Gregory around the year 600, etc., etc.? You get my point. We all do it, often without even thinking, and it's a huge obstacle to ecumenical progress. Partisan history, by its very nature, will always divide us. But that is not the same as claiming that history itself will always divide us. Secular examples like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in the 1990s in South Africa show the healing that can happen when both sides in a conflict face up to the realities of history together. It's not easy, but it is possible to go back and write history together. That's the way to a healing of memories. And the decision by Rome and Constantinople in 1965 to revoke, and I quote, erase from memory the mutual excommunications of 1054, which so poisoned relations between West and East, is an outstanding example of such a healing of memories. Only love and a readiness to say sorry makes that possible. I always say that the first principle of ecumenism is, where there's a will, there's a way. We have to be ready to forgive one another, to love one another, to draw a line under history and to move on, knowing that the fullness of truth lies ahead of us, not behind. At the Last Supper, Jesus said that the Holy Spirit will guide you into all the truth. It lies ahead of us. Ecumenism, I suppose we might say, is wanting to make that journey together. Pope John Paul II once asked, why did the Holy Spirit permit all these divisions? He acknowledged that part of the cause was human sin. But, he said, there's more to it than that. We trust that God can bring good even from evil. And so, he said, could it not be that these divisions have also been a path continually leading the church to discover the untold wealth contained in Christ's gospel and in the redemption accomplished in Christ? Perhaps, he said, all this wealth would not have come to light otherwise. It's an absolutely fascinating thought that perhaps the divisions of Christianity are caused not so much by a surfeit of sin, but rather by the sheer abundance of truth that finite human beings struggle to grasp and to hold together. Every Christian tradition treasures at least some aspects of the one truth of Christ, and each is really holding those gifts in trust on behalf of all of us, because they truly belong to all of us. Even though we might, therefore, appreciate the various separate conservation efforts, if we may call them that, we can't, therefore, justify continuing division said Pope John Paul. The time must come, he said, and it was in his very characteristic italics, the emphasized passages in so many of his writings. The time must come for the love that unites us to be manifested. And he thought that that time was now. That's surely why, in his famous encyclical letter, Ut Unum Sint, in 1995 on ecumenism, he said that ecumenical dialogue is always an exchange of gifts. Now, it's certainly true that Catholics and Orthodox have gifts to share, particularly with regard to synodality and primacy. In an important speech at Vatican II, Bishop Elias Zogby of the Melkite Greek Catholic Church, positioned as it were, therefore, between Catholics and Orthodox. The Melkites often consider themselves as a bridging church in many ways. Bishop Elias Zogby said that the great schism between East and West had mutilated both sides, and that was his word, mutilated. And I quote, "When it lost communion with the apostolic sees of the East, the Western Church lost the most collegial segment of the Episcopal College. Centralization," he said, "was carried out at an extraordinary pace without anyone being able to hold it in check." On the other hand, he said, at that time, the Eastern churches lost communion with the center of unity of the whole church, which is the Bishop of Rome. Excessive decentralization, he said, has weakened them considerably, the Eastern churches, making difficult, and I'm quoting, "the regular practice of episcopal collegiality, which nevertheless remains their principal system of government." End of quote. And what he then said is so like what Pope John Paul said 30 years later that you almost wonder whether the young Archbishop of Krakow was listening very attentively to Zogby's speech in St. Peter's that day. "God draws good from evil," said Zogby. And he wanted this unhappy break to protect the Orthodox churches from centralization and Latinization, so that in the fullness of time, our dialogue would be immensely profitable and bring great enrichment to the church when it is again made one. Remarkable words. Remarkable words. So let's just see how we set out on that blessed path, and just glance very briefly at the historical chart. The lifting of the anathemas is there, 1965. You see the dates on the left, the 7th of December. And just above it, there is the date, the 5th of January, 1964, when Pope Paul VI met Ecumenical Patriarch Athenagoras on the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem. That historic encounter really inaugurated the modern push for reconciliation between Catholics and Orthodox after 900 years of separation. And regular prominent meetings of successive popes and ecumenical patriarchs have been a notable feature of Catholic-Orthodox relations ever since. Now, the election of Pope Francis in 2013 has had a galvanizing effect, not only on the Catholic Church and the world at large, but also on Catholic-Orthodox dialogue. When Pope Francis first appeared on the balcony of St. Peter's after his election, he instantly sent some new signals about his ministry and his office and his perception of it. He referred to himself not as the new Supreme Pontiff, but as the new Bishop of Rome. And he used St. Ignatius of Antioch's phrase from the earliest patristic times, when he referred to Rome as the church which presides in charity, implicitly understanding the church as a communion, not as a pyramid. 6 days later, for the first time ever, a Patriarch of Constantinople attended the inauguration of a new Bishop of Rome. Apparently because Patriarch Bartholomew was simply so impressed by those first words of the new Pope. The two leaders met again in May 2014 in Jerusalem, commemorating 50 years since that first meeting of Pope Paul and Patriarch Athenagoras. And then they met again in November 2014, when Pope Francis visited Constantinople for the Feast of St. Andrew. In Constantinople, Pope Francis made a most important statement, reiterating exactly some of the key decisions of Vatican II, which have really changed the whole framework for Catholic Orthodox relations. He said this: "The restoration of full communion does not signify the submission of one to the other or assimilation." And then very simply and clearly, he said the following: "I want to assure each one of you here that to reach the desired goal of full unity, the Catholic Church does not intend to impose any conditions except that of the shared profession of faith. Further, I would add that we are ready to seek together, in light of scriptural teaching and the experience of the first millennium, the ways in which we can guarantee the needed unity of the Church in the present circumstances. The one thing that the Catholic Church desires, and that I seek as Bishop of Rome, the Church which presides in charity, is communion with the Orthodox churches." End of quote. What the Catholic Church and the Pope himself are seeking, therefore, is communion with the Orthodox churches, not jurisdiction over them. That needs to be emphasized again and again. It's what pertained in the first millennium, which is our guide, as we have long recognized. At that time, as we've heard several times now from the Chieti document, the Bishop of Rome did not exercise canonical authority over the churches of the East. Last year saw the historic meeting between Pope Francis and Patriarch Kirill of Moscow in Havana, Cuba, in February, and of course the Holy and Great Council held in June on the island of Crete. The Council said very firmly, and I quote, "The Orthodox Church believes unflinchingly that she occupies a central place in the matter of the promotion of Christian unity in the world today." That's a very important statement, refuting those Orthodox who object to ecumenism. Unfortunately, I think we must say, from a Catholic point of view, the document said nothing in particular about the Catholic Church, unlike the strong recognition of the special status of the Eastern churches in Vatican II's decree on ecumenism. Nevertheless, while only 10 of the 14 autocephalous Orthodox churches actually attended the council, 13 of them took part in the plenary session of our dialogue just a few months later in Chieti. That large turnout for the Catholic Orthodox plenary, I think, was deeply encouraging. 1964 was indeed the breakthrough year for Catholic ecumenism. If we just look back to the chart, Pope Paul VI and Patriarch Athenagoras met in January, as we've seen. And then if you just look a little bit higher up the chart, where it says Vatican II, 1962 to 65, you'll see there that I've mentioned 3 particular documents, which were all promulgated on the same day, the 21st of November, 1964. Namely, the Council's dogmatic constitution on the Church, Lumen Gentium, its decree on ecumenism, Unitatis Redintegratio, and its decree on the Catholic Eastern Churches, Orientalium Ecclesiarum. Those three documents form a very closely related trio. And what followed, for 15 years afterwards, was the so-called dialogue of charity between Catholics and Orthodox, getting to know and love one another again after such a very long estrangement. And then in 1979, you see on the chart, if we turn over the page, Pope John Paul II and Ecumenical Patriarch Demetrios announced the start of the theological dialogue, the so-called dialogue of truth, which necessarily relies upon a continuing dialogue of charity. Let us never forget that. The theological dialogue made strong progress through the 1980s. It hit severe difficulties, however, around 1990 with the fall of communism. A new freedom of religion allowed many members of those Catholic Eastern churches, often brutally repressed under the Soviet Empire, to reassert their Catholic identity, thus raising again the thorny issue of what's often called Uniatism, namely the existence of Eastern churches in communion with Rome. Orthodox delegates insisted that that be moved to the top of the agenda, and a statement on Uniatism, firmly calling it the method of union of the past and contrasting it with the present search for full communion, was agreed in 1993. But even that did not clear the air. A very unproductive meeting was held in Baltimore in the year 2000. And then, sadly, the dialogue rather came to a halt. Happily, it resumed in 2005, largely because of some very significant gestures of charity by Pope John Paul in the meantime. And it was then, in 2005, when things got started up again and the commission was rather reconstituted, that Metropolitan Kallistos and I and various others came on board. The newly constituted International Dialogue held its first plenary meeting in Belgrade in 2006. And it's worth noticing that we were welcomed to Serbia not only by the Serbian Orthodox Church, but also by the civil authorities. Both the Prime Minister and the President of Serbia hosted dinners for us. Why? Well, the Prime Minister said this: the churches of East and West are setting an extraordinary example by their dialogue. There is no alternative to dialogue if confronted peoples and communities are to achieve peace, confidence, solidarity, and cooperation. End of quote. It's pretty clear the world warms to the witness of dialogue. Even before the full communion that we hope and pray for, our very dialogue is a work of God's grace and a sign of peace. Cardinal Kasper once said that in the 20th century, which was horribly marked by war and innocent suffering, ecumenism was, and I quote, a light shining in the darkness and a powerful peace movement. End of quote. When the formal international dialogue began in 1980, it was decided very wisely that it should begin with the elements which unite the Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches. And if you look on your chart, on the back of it there, the back of the sheet, you'll see that there were various statements. 1982, you see I've marked the Catholic Orthodox statement by a C/O. 1982, the statement on the Eucharist, the Church, and the Trinity. Then 1987, a statement on faith, sacraments, and ecclesial unity. And then 1988, a statement on ordination and apostolic succession. All of those, notice how quickly those documents tumbled one after another. It was marvellous, as a blessed reminder of how much Catholics and Orthodox share. Now, there was a reason for that particular sequence of topics. Catholics and Orthodox want to share the Eucharist together again. That will be the sign and the seal of our full communion. That's what the phrase means. Now, if we are to do that, first of all, we must agree on what the Eucharist actually is. And that was the purpose of the first statement. Then, there are various conditions that are necessary for participation in the Eucharist, especially baptism and unity in faith. Well, the second statement dealt with those topics. Then also, the celebration of the Eucharist requires ministers, bishops and priests, properly ordained in apostolic succession. And so the third statement considered those matters. Now, if you think of it, the proper celebration of the Eucharist by the bishop and his presbyters in each local church actually requires two kinds of communion. We might call them vertical and horizontal. Apostolic succession expresses the communion of bishops vertically, as it were, going through history, going through time. And synodality, or what Catholics normally call collegiality, expresses the communion of bishops horizontally across the world today. So a fourth document was planned dealing with that final point, almost, you might say, like the last piece of the jigsaw. The whole scheme was focused on preparing the ground for us to celebrate the Eucharist together once again. A draft of that fourth document was prepared in 1990, when the Iron Curtain fell and the complexities that I mentioned earlier began. And so the draft had to be set aside. But it was that draft, duly revised, that in the fullness of time became the very important Ravenna document of 2007 on communion, conciliarity, and authority in the Church. Now, ever since this dialogue began, it has been concerned to clarify what the Church's communion life should actually look like. Ravenna responded to that question by distinguishing three levels in the life of the Church: the local level, the regional level, and the universal level. The history and tradition of the Church shows that at each level, the communion life or synodality that is characteristic of the Church has had a focal point in the one who is first, or head, protos, kephale, and that's where primacy comes in the very midst of synodality. The bishop is the first or the head among his people in the local church. The metropolitan or patriarch is first or head among the bishops at the regional level of the church. And there has also been, and ought to be, a first or a head at the universal level among the metropolitans and patriarchs. I quote from Ravenna: "Primacy at all levels is a practice firmly grounded in the canonical tradition of the Church." But Ravenna also said that primacy and conciliarity or synodality are mutually interdependent. Those two affirmations, that primacy at all levels is firmly grounded in the canonical tradition of the Church, but that primacy and synodality are mutually interdependent, those two affirmations were really crucial achievements of the Ravenna document. And the Chieti document reiterates them, together with the idea of there being three levels in the Church's life, as Ravenna said. That's important for continuity, yes, but it's also important because the Russian delegates left the Ravenna meeting, as we heard earlier today from Metropolitan Kallistos, and Moscow, therefore, never accepted the Ravenna document. I must, if I may, just beg to quibble a little bit with what Metropolitan Kallistos said in consequence, though, Metropolitan Kallistos said that therefore the Ravenna document was simply a working document of the dialogue and not an agreed statement. My understanding is that the Ravenna document is indeed an agreed statement, because there is an understanding among the Orthodox churches that if one church or even a number of churches withdraw from the dialogue and others are willing to stay, then the dialogue continues, and if it achieves an agreed statement, that agreed statement stands. So Ravenna is indeed an agreed statement of the dialogue. Now the important thing for our purpose here, though, is that Russian Orthodox delegates were present in Chieti. And that means, you see, that we're now all back on the same page regarding the essentials. Chieti itself says, and I quote, "Christian tradition makes it clear that within the synodal life of the church at various levels, a bishop has been acknowledged as the first." And it refers to synodality and primacy as interrelated, complementary, and inseparable. However, as it says, different understandings of synodality and primacy played a significant role in the divisions between Orthodox and Catholics. And that's why it's essential now to try and establish a common understanding of these realities. That's exactly what we then tried to do, with a particular focus on the universal level, where historically, of course, the main problems lie. Now, it's important to note that it's fully agreed between us, Catholics and Orthodox, that there is only one candidate for the office of Universal Primate, namely the Bishop of Rome. Ravenna and Chieti both recognize that Rome has always been first in the listing or taxes of the major sees that took shape between the 4th and the 7th centuries. The formal listing was Rome, Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem, in that order. And Chieti reproduces all the relevant canons in a very long footnote. Rome exercised a primacy of honor, says Chieti, recalling a phrase used by the Council of Constantinople in 381, of the Patriarch of Constantinople, of course, in that particular context. Interestingly, at no point does Chieti use the phrase first among equals, primus inter pares, because although that phrase is very often used and heard today, it appears to have no patristic warrant. The local Church of Rome presides in love, said St. Ignatius of Antioch. Pope Francis often recalls those words, as we've seen, and so did Ravenna. And Ravenna ended by saying that what was needed was for the role of the Bishop of Rome in the communion of all the churches to be studied in greater depth. In other words, what exactly does presiding in charity actually mean? Chieti tries to give at least the start of an answer. Scholars have pointed out that properly understood, primacy of honor doesn't mean just some sort of honorific primacy. Far from it. It actually refers to the serious tasks and responsibilities that have to be carried out by the one who holds the first place, the primacy. Chieti identifies various roles and responsibilities that the Bishop of Rome had in the first millennium. First of all, it refers to the fact that although the Bishop of Rome didn't personally attend any of the ecumenical councils held in the first millennium, I quote, "In each case, either he was represented by his legates, or he agreed with the council's conclusions post factum," end of quote. Chieti quotes the Second Council of Nicaea in 787, which gave the most detailed listing of criteria for a council to be recognized as ecumenical. One of those conditions being that the council had the cooperation or synergeia of the Bishop of Rome. So there can't be an ecumenical council without the Bishop of Rome's involvement in some capacity. And that's one of the reasons, clearly, why the Great and Holy Council, for instance, held, of course, without the participation of Pope Francis, made no claim to be ecumenical. Then also, Chieti notes that the role that the Bishop of Rome played in receiving appeals from different parts of the Church, both West and East, particularly from bishops who felt that they had been deposed unjustly. It notes the provisions of the Synod of Sardica, held in 343, which specified that if he considered the appeal was justified, the Bishop of Rome could order a retrial to be conducted by the bishops of the province neighbouring the deposed bishop's own province. In other words, he could act to resolve the issue, but he couldn't impose his own judgment. And that's why Chieti makes that significant statement that we've heard so often, we might almost all quote now together, namely that the Bishop of Rome did not exercise canonical authority over the churches of the East. Now the phrase, strictly speaking, I think, is not perfect, because in a sense the canons of Sardica constitute precisely such a canonical authority. There is a canonical action the Pope can perform vis-à-vis the churches of the East. But I think the intention of that phrase is clear. In later terminology, it means that the Bishop of Rome did not exercise direct jurisdiction over the churches of the East. Now, those two specific responsibilities of the Bishop of Rome, recognized in the Chieti text, fit very closely with the teaching of Vatican II. In Lumen Gentium, the Council said, and I quote, "There never is an ecumenical council which is not confirmed or at least recognized as such by Peter's successor." And the Decree on Ecumenism said, "For many centuries the churches of the East and the West went their own ways, though a brotherly communion of faith and sacramental life bound them together. If disagreements in faith and discipline arose among them, the Roman See acted by common consent as moderator." Now, in my book, A Service of Love, and there are one or two flyers for the book going around, which came out first of all in 2013 and then again last year with a new postscript taking account of the first years of Pope Francis, I outlined the fascinating new thinking about the role of the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, that has taken place on the Catholic side in the last 50 years or so, beginning around about the time of the Council, locating the Pope not so much at the top of a pyramid, but rather at the heart of an ecclesiology of communion, a Eucharistic ecclesiology. And I suggested that the fundamental task of the Bishop of Rome is to serve the Eucharistic communion of the Church. Lumen Gentium 22, the same passage that I just quoted from before, describes how Peter's successor, the Roman Pontiff, and the bishops, successors of the apostles, are united with one another in a close collegial bond. And it recalls, and I quote, "the very ancient discipline whereby the bishops installed throughout the whole world lived in communion with one another and with the Roman Pontiff in a bond of unity, charity, and peace." Now, unity, charity, and peace are all fruits of the Eucharist, are they not? "Because there is one bread," says St. Paul, "we who are many are one body. There is one body and one Spirit," he says to the Ephesians. "So maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace." By serving in a multitude of ways the Church's unity, charity, and peace, the Bishop of Rome can be said to be exercising what is fundamentally a Eucharistic responsibility, helping the Church to live out the Eucharistic mystery at the heart of its life, in accordance with Henri de Lubac's famous principle, the Eucharist makes the Church. Now, very interestingly, if you think about it, Those two papal tasks identified by Chieti and already mentioned by Vatican II, the link between the Bishop of Rome and ecumenical councils and the role of the Bishop of Rome in moderating disputes, they can be fitted into that picture. Let's recall the normal flow of the liturgy. Before we come to the moment of Holy Communion, there's a profession of faith, the creed, and a sign of peace. Those are very significant preparatory moments, showing that those who ultimately receive the Eucharist together must be right in their faith and at peace with one another. Now, councils determine what is rightness of faith, and dealing with appeals is an instrument for settling disputes and restoring peace. So if you see what I mean, anchoring the Church's ecumenical councils on one hand and moderating disputes on the other can be seen as two very particular ways in which the Bishop of Rome serves the Eucharistic unity of the Church in faith and communion. By their very nature, of course, those two tasks are only carried out occasionally as need arises. But symbolizing, serving, and strengthening the Church's Eucharistic unity in faith and communion can be said to be the Bishop of Rome's abiding, daily responsibility, exercised in countless ways. And I, myself, was very moved to hear dear Metropolitan Kallistos when he himself was seeking for a kind of wider remit for the Bishop of Rome's responsibility, not in a juridical format, but simply as a universal solicitude. You remember how he used that phrase of St. Paul, how he felt a concern for all of the churches. And Metropolitan Kallistos said he would readily warm to such a description of the Pope's task, a solicitude for the universal communion. And what I'm saying here is very, very similar, but putting it, if you like, into a more explicitly Eucharistic modality, because communion is what we enjoy from God as a gift given through the Eucharist. Now, you may be surprised to discover how closely that idea, this Eucharistic idea of the papacy, relates to the teaching of Vatican I, which everyone naturally recalls with regard to Catholic teaching on the papacy and tends to get worried about in an ecumenical setting. Oh, Vatican I. Don't mention Vatican I. Well, there's no need to worry. There's much more to Vatican I than we often realize. For example, Vatican I taught that papal primacy exists, and I quote, so that the episcopate itself might be one and undivided, and that the whole multitude of believers might be preserved in faith and communion by means of a closely united priesthood. End of quote. Well, we think of Vatican II as promoting an ecclesiology of communion, and that's perfectly correct. But notice the word communion, a Eucharistic word, being used already there at Vatican I. And we may note also the Eucharistic idea of primacy enabling the bishops to form a closely united priesthood there in the teaching of Vatican I as well. So a Eucharistic understanding of the papacy, it seems to me, is compatible not just with Vatican II very explicitly, but also with Vatican I. And in fact, goes all the way back to the scriptures and to the fathers, it might well be said. So coming back to our context here, we're almost done. One of the great benefits of a Eucharistic approach to the role of the Bishop of Rome, in line with the early church presiding in charity, is that it opens new doors to dialogue between Catholics and Orthodox on this highly contentious issue. Let's recall that the split between Christian West and East, 1054, occurred at the very time of the development in the West of a different, primarily juridical understanding of the papacy, positioned at the top of an institutional pyramid, rather than at the heart of a Eucharistic communion. And that surely was no coincidence. Ever since it began, as we saw earlier, Catholic Orthodox dialogue has had a Eucharistic focus and has adopted a Eucharistic ecclesiology. So let's just ask finally whether the Chieti document has any openings towards a Eucharistic understanding of the Bishop of Rome. Well, we've seen how it links the Bishop of Rome to the holding of ecumenical councils and to receiving appeals, and we've seen that both of those can be fitted into a Eucharistic picture. But does Chieti say anything more directly Eucharistic about the role of the Bishop of Rome? Yes, it does. It says that the taxis, or ordering of the major sees, had, and I quote, its highest expression in the celebration of the Holy Eucharist, end of quote. The Eucharist is the highest expression of the Church, our bond of unity. And it's important to know who will preside at a liturgy involving several primates, and how everyone should stand. Where does everyone go in such a liturgy? They stand, says the Chieti document, according to the taxis. And this practice, it says, manifested the Eucharistic character of the communion between the primates. Now, when we recall that the Bishop of Rome occupies the first place in the taxis, I think we can certainly say that Chieti is open to a Eucharistic understanding of his role and his ministry among his fellow primates, all of them within the communion of the people of God as a whole. As we've seen, such an understanding serves to unify the various tasks proper to the Bishop of Rome that Chieti identifies, and it fits very neatly within the Eucharistic understanding of the Church that has guided the international Catholic Orthodox dialogue since its very beginning in 1980. Now, clearly, there is more work to do. But this would seem potentially to be a very promising and consistent way for the dialogue to address this most difficult issue of all between us. And it seems appropriate to close with some words of the Catholic theologian Jean Tillard, one of the initial architects of the Catholic Orthodox international dialogue, together with John Zizioulas, now Metropolitan John of Pergamon, back around about 1980, when it all began and was mapped out. In Tillard's famous book on the Bishop of Rome in 1983, he said, "The Church is not made by the papacy, it's made by baptism and Eucharist. The purpose of the papacy," he said, "is to give the Eucharist its full dimensions." Thank you.